I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, a new play on Broadway entitled Oslo. Written by J.T. Rogers, a veteran playwright whose works have been produced across the United States, in Germany, and in Israel. J.T. tells the story of Oslo. It's the backstory of the Oslo Accords, which culminated in that historic handshake in 1993 between Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and PLO President Yasser Arafat. The play is being produced at the Lincoln Center Theater with its resident director, Bart Scherer, and played a very successful limited engagement with excellent reviews from Ben Brantley of the New York Times at Lincoln Center's smaller house, the Mitzi E. Newhouse Theater. It's now scheduled to reopen at the larger Vivian Beaumont Theater. Oslo stars a most versatile and fabulous Broadway actor, Jefferson Mays, opposite Jennifer L., who plays his wife. The two play a real-life couple in Norway, one an academic, Professor Larsen, the other his wife, a Foreign Service officer, Mona Juul, who virtually single-handedly, according to the play, paved the way for unofficial meetings between Palestinian and Israeli representatives that evolved into a full-blown agreement between then Israeli Foreign Minister Shimon Peres, representing Yitzhak Rabin, and his Palestinian counterpart, who represented Yasser Arafat. In fact, J.T. Rogers has described that he came to write the play after meeting with Mr. Larsen and Ms. Juul, hearing their story, and they persuaded him that their story should be told in dramatic fashion. And the play Oslo is told from their perspective with a superb cast of actors, including Michael Aronov, who plays the Israeli diplomat Uri Savir brilliantly. Uri Savir had been consul general in New York City for a short time before being recalled back to Israel to work closely with Foreign Minister Shimon Peres. Another Israeli diplomat working in the foreign ministry at the time of Oslo, Yossi Belin, also played wonderfully by Adam Danheiser, who recently appeared in the revival of Fiddler on the Roof, was the first to sanction the unofficial talks in Norway, and then to send Uri Savir into the negotiations when they became serious. Now, I have seen the play Oslo. It is terrific, entertaining, gripping, all three acts. But the playwright makes no secret of the fact that the events in the play, while all based on the real story and real characters who participated in the actual events, the play is his version of Oslo. Locations have been condensed. The chronology of events has been compressed. Some of the actual players have been excised. They're not in the play. Some in the play have been assigned different roles from what they actually played in reality. And most important of all, every single word in the play are those of J.T. Rogers. They are not the real words ever spoken by the real-life characters. And herein lies the rub. People who see the play and who come with no historical context, no understanding of the broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or any knowledge of the real history of Oslo, leave the theater thinking they saw the real story. In J.T. Rogers' play, one comes away very sympathetic to the Palestinians and their just cause. And in the epilogue of the play, when all the actors assemble on stage to tell what happened to their respective character, and then describe the collapse of the Oslo process, it's not at all clear that a second intifada was started by Yasser Arafat shortly after that famous handshake, bringing Oslo crashing down around all those who had so optimistically and idealistically believed that a new dawn was breaking in the Israeli-Palestinian relationship. At one point, for example, the Palestinian diplomat catalogs the sins of the Israeli army, castigating Israeli soldiers for, quote, shooting Palestinian children for sport. An outrageous lie, which in the play Uri Savir does not answer at all. Well, what was the truth behind the scenes of the Oslo peace process? For some real understanding, I'm so pleased to have on our JBS phones from Boston an historian and author, Kenneth Levin, who's also a psychiatrist associated with Harvard Medical School. And Ken has written a book entitled The Oslo Syndrome, Delusions of a People Under Siege. And Ken, I thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Mark.
Ken, you wrote this, The Oslo Syndrome, and you used the word syndrome very consciously and purposefully. What was your intent in writing the book?
Well, my intent was to look at why the Israelis would sign on to something that was obvious to anyone who looked at the facts on the ground was going to be disastrous for Israel. That Arafat was making clear before the signing of the Accords, from the very beginning of the Oslo process, and in the years immediately following, that his goal remained Israel's destruction. He openly acknowledged that. And the Israelis chose to delude themselves and believe that they were on a path to peace. And I was looking at both the historical understanding of this and a psychological understanding of it.
By the way, talk to me for one moment about your very impressive background. On the one hand, you have a PhD in history from Princeton, correct?
Yes.
At the same time, you are a practicing psychiatrist and you're associated with Harvard Medical College, right?
Yeah, I taught for Harvard for 40 years. I've recently stopped teaching. I'm still practicing psychiatry.
Okay. And, explain to me where are you from originally, Ken?
Philadelphia.
Okay. So how do you get involved in these two disciplines and then you build a bridge that connects them? How does that happen?
Well, I had the good fortune of growing up at a time when there were means to get a good education, even if one didn't have great funds. It's not like tuitions today. And I was helped along by various universities. And I started out as an undergraduate at Penn. I had a degree in mathematics, then got a fellowship degree at Oxford in English language and literature, and came back to med school at Penn, but was interested also in 19th century intellectual history, particularly, both in terms of what I had done in the past and some other things I had done. And the program at Princeton, the history program, afforded me a chance to explore that as well. So, and both universities were very helpful in going back between Penn and Princeton, doing the medical degree at Penn and the doctorate at Princeton.
Well, it sounds wonderful. You are a fascinating individual, and you and I hope one day to sit together and have you in studio.
Great.
What's your association with Israel? What's your feeling for Israel, and to what extent are you familiar with Israel and its people?
I am very familiar too. I'm very dedicated to Israel's cause. I get there at least once a year. I am very involved with it on many levels.
Okay. And what about the Oslo process itself? You heard me describe the play Oslo. As I described it, did anything immediately jump to your mind that sounded, in some way out of place?
Well, the notion that the Palestinians are victims of Israel, and that Israel, well, as you pointed out, the nonsense of claiming that Israeli soldiers shoot Palestinian children for sport, this sort of thing is what one hears very commonly from the Palestinians, and it's picked up in Europe, but obviously it's the furthest thing from the truth. In fact, what happened was the Norwegians who were involved in Oslo were eager to pursue peace. It wasn't going to be their blood that would be spilled if it failed. And there were many Israelis, particularly people around. Yossi Beilin was the main driver of the Oslo process, but Peres went along and others. And to show you how nonsensical or self-destructive the process was, you referred to the handshake on the White House lawn in September of 1993. That very evening, Yasser Arafat was on Jordanian television from Washington explaining to his constituency and to the broader Arab world that they should understand Oslo as the first phase in the PLO's plan of phases. This was a plan articulated in 1974 by the PLO in which they stated that it would take whatever territory it could get by negotiations and use that territory as a base for pursuing Israel's destruction. That's what he said on the night of the handshake. He had said it before, leading up to that night. He said it many times, at least a dozen times within a month of the handshake, and he made other references to the goal remaining Israel's destruction. He also, from the time he arrived in the territories in July of '94, when he arrived in Gaza, until the fall of the Labor Meretz government that had created Oslo in May of '96, in those 22 months, there was more terror. Terror was going on at a greater rate than Israel had ever known in the past. Of course, it pales by comparison to what happened after Arafat launched his terror war in 2000, but it was still terrible, and yet people were, not a majority at that point, but at least almost half of Israelis were still going along and somehow imagined that this would be peace, choosing to delude themselves in that way.
The play suggests that Rabin's assassination was in some way a function of the extent to which the Israeli people were not able to get behind a legitimate peace process, which, according to the play, was very much wanted by the entire Palestinian leadership. It's interesting, Ken, at one point, I have no idea if this is historically accurate. My instinct, I'm very suspicious of it. The play culminates with Shimon Peres on the phone with a counterpart in the Palestinian territories somewhere outside. When I say territories, it wasn't on the West Bank or Gaza. It was probably in some European country. He's on the phone with them, and they're hammering out the last details. And when Peres finally agrees, the last point is dealt with. It's Jerusalem, and in the play, Peres says, okay, we will agree to delay working out an agreement on Jerusalem. That's the last point. According to the play, there is weeping on the other side of the phone by Arafat and all the members of the Palestinian Council who were seated around him. This was to show the extent to which the Palestinians really, truly, from the leadership on down, wanted a peace agreement with Israel. And then it's only moments later when the symbol of the peace movement in Israel, Yitzhak Rabin, is assassinated in the state of Israel. And the epilogue of the play suggests that begins a process of unraveling Oslo altogether. What's your reaction to that?
That's utter nonsense. First of all, the claim that the Palestinians wanted a genuine peace is 180 degrees from the truth. As I said, they were constantly telling their own people that they should view Oslo as the first step towards Israel's annihilation. So that's hardly, you can say they were offering Israel the peace of the dead, but nothing beyond that. As far as Rabin's assassination, the terror had increased, it was rampant, as I said, from the time of Arafat's arrival in '94, and in July of 94. Rabin was assassinated in the fall of 95. And in the polls, the Israelis initially, majority, were in favor of Oslo. But as more and more terror following Arafat's arrival, somewhat before Arafat's arrival too, but particularly after Arafat's arrival, and with more and more terror, the tide began to turn in Israeli opinion, and polls generally, shifted. If you look at polls through the end of '94 through '95, opinion is shifting. That if an election were held, they were saying that the Likud would win because people were disenchanted by the terror and the fact that the Israeli government, the Rabin Peres administration, were not doing anything to address the terror. Not only that, they even knew from their intelligence services that Arafat was working with Hamas to generate the terror, and yet they were saying, no, it's Hamas doing it, and Arafat is genuinely interested in peace. In fact, one of the responses to terror, and this sounds insane today, but it happened then, there were people in the government arguing that the answer to the increased terror was to give the Palestinians more land more quickly. The rationale for this was, well, Arafat really wanted to clamp down on it, and he couldn't because he didn't have the standing with the people to do so. But if we were given more land more quickly, and the people, the Palestinians, saw the results of the peace more quickly, then they would be more. They would back him in clamping down on Hamas. And this is while Arafat is in fact colluding with Hamas in the terror.
And the bottom line for you, therefore, making sure everybody understands your point, your bottom line is?
My bottom line is that, well, the way I couch it in the book, and to understand it is, it requires an understanding of the psychology of chronically besieged populations. And in Jewish terms, that means looking at chronic besiegement of diaspora communities, minority communities under siege of the surrounding majority, and the chronic siege of Israel in the face of Arab rejectionism. And invariably, there are elements in those in such communities that embrace the indictments of the besiegers, however ridiculous, however bigoted, however biased, in the hopes that somehow they could accommodate them. They could, if they reform to adjust to the attack on them, then they will win relief. And one sees this constantly throughout the history of the diaspora, and of course not the entire communities, but parts of it, communities invariably. And one sees it through Israel's history as well. Mm-hmm. And the analogy on the level of individual psychology is abused child. Abused children always blame themselves for the abuse. And why is that? It's not because they're naive, as many people say, but they really only have two choices. If assuming I'm talking about children with chronic abuse, usually parental abuse, either they could say, I'm helpless and it's hopeless and there's nothing I could do about it because I'm the child, they're the adults, I'm stuck here. Or they can say, no, it's happening to me because I'm bad, and if I become good, they'll change their behavior towards me. They'll treat me better. And this is what happens with besieged populations. There are elements of it will say, this is happening because somehow we've provoked it. And if only we reform, then it'll be good. Then we'll have peace. Mm-hmm. So the Arabs could be saying, or the Arafat could be saying, well, our aim is Israel's annihilation, and there'll be Israelis who say, no, he doesn't really mean it. If we give back enough territory, if we make enough concessions, if we change our flag, if we change, our national anthem, then those concessions will be enough to win genuine peace, despite what he's saying.
And you're saying that's really nonsense, isn't it?
It's total nonsense. Well, most Israelis woke up, but unfortunately it required a huge spilling of blood when Arafat launched his terror war. Even the terror that was occurring between 93 and 2000, there was a majority who began to say, who in polls were against it, but almost half were still supporting Oslo. Now, after Camp David, when we had all the concessions from Barack and from Clinton, and Arafat did not even offer counter proposals. He just walked out and started his terror war. And in the ensuing several years, over 1,000 Israelis were killed and several thousand more horribly maimed, then the Israeli opinion began to shift more dramatically. But it's horrible that that's what was required to wake them up to what was clear in '93.
I want to come back, if we have time, to the entire Jewish psyche that you talked about. If we don't get to it in this half hour, when you're here in studio, we'll talk about it more. I want to ask you, though, to comment on another aspect that the play presented. The play presented that the PLO, the Palestinians, had an overarching goal in mind, that they wanted Israel to acknowledge the PLO as the legitimate voice of the Palestinian people. And what Israelis wanted was for the PLO to formally recognize Israel's legitimacy as a Jewish state. Did either of those two things happen, to your knowledge?
Well, Israel did acknowledge the PLO as the official voice of the Palestinians.
And what about the converse?
Not at all. In fact, you still have Abbas now saying, just Arafat's successor, saying he will never recognize the legitimacy of a Jewish state. He says that today.
Yes. Incidentally, does this surprise you?
No surprise at all.
Wait a minute. In J.T. Rogers' play, the reference to the Palestinian Charter never appears. One would never, if one walked into that play knowing nothing, one would not know there was a Palestinian Charter, or that the Palestinian Charter called for the destruction of the state of Israel, that the Zionist entity in the land of Palestine had no right to exist. And one of the issues, Ken, always was, to what extent would Arafat change the PLO Charter as a result of Oslo? First, speak to whether you're surprised that a play that purports to tell us the story of Oslo never mentions the Palestinian Charter, and then comment on the history as it relates to the Charter.
I'm not surprised it wouldn't mention it. And although some will mention and say that, in fact, they did abridge the Charter because there was a ceremony involving Clinton that supposedly amended the Charter. But in fact, it has not. You can go on the Fatah site now online and see what the Charter is, and it's the same as it always was. There's nothing different.
It bothered me, but you say you're not surprised. Why aren't you surprised? This is a play that purports to tell the backstory of Oslo. One of the things...
It's clear. Well, first of all, these Norwegian protagonists were predisposed to embracing Palestinian perspectives and blaming Israel for any failure.
Yes.
And so if he's telling you from their viewpoint, there's no surprise.
Mm-hmm. But it's a very important point. Do you understand, and I have seen the play. I actually saw the play twice for professional reasons. And I went with people who are committed Jews, committed to the state of Israel, profoundly committed. I wasn't with other people who I met coming out of the theater. They passionately committed to the state of Israel, although again, leaning far to the left. But there were people who just thought the play was terrific. And I walk out of there very upset because, as I said in the open, I worry, Ken, that there will be, college students from NYU, let alone from Columbia or Barnard, or high school kids, or young adults, or older adults, who have no knowledge or understanding of the things you're describing here, who will walk out of that play thinking that the Israelis and the Palestinians were at worst equal, at best the Palestinians had a sort of a moral edge over the Israelis. They were much more refined than the early Israelis in the process, who were kind of schlumpy professors that Yossi Beilin, according to the play, threw into the mix. And only later does Uri Savir come in, and Uri Savir is a kind of I don't know, wild Israeli bouncing all over the place. And in the end, here comes the Jewish lawyer, the Israeli lawyer who was with a big Washington law firm. And my own feeling is that this play does nothing good for the truth or the state of Israel. And I want to hear your comment.
Well, it certainly does nothing good for the truth as you described it. I mean, I've not seen it. I'm going by your description of it. Was very vivid and in some detail, and it bears no relationship to the truth. 180 degrees opposite the truth, it's inevitably insidious and has negative consequences. Now, when you talk about Jews who think it's wonderful, or are sympathetic to Israel, but think it's wonderful, or college students who go to it and know very little, I think that is true. That is a danger, and I think it reflects in part a failure of Jewish leadership here to educate the community about what, in fact, went on in Oslo, what, in fact, goes on today. There is, in fact, I just wrote an article that will appear, I think, in the next day or two on this very issue. Because there is a drift, because, again, the American Jewish community did not go through what the Israelis went through. The Israelis were following this process and paid terrible price for it, for their wishful thinking, for their self-delusion. They paid a terrible price. So they're not in the mood to do it again. The Americans can go on deluding themselves about the potential that if only Israelis made more concessions.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
The other thing that's worth noting is that among the, and we can get into this another time perhaps, among those who tend to embrace these delusions, invariably overrepresented are the elites, the cultural elites, the academic elites, the journalistic elites, and elements of the political elites.
You're absolutely right.
And so even though the percentage of Israelis who would embrace an Oslo type process at this point has shrunk tremendously, overrepresented among those who still think Oslo was the greatest thing since sliced bread are elites. And they're the ones that are the most vocal, and they're the ones that American Jewish community often hear from. They're the playwrights whose anti-Israel plays you see staged in New York and in London and elsewhere. But through that, they're the ones who produce the films that are critical of Israel almost exclusively and appear in all the Israel film festivals across the United States. So one gets a false impression. It's easy to get a false impression of Israeli opinion.
Ken, it has been a joy meeting you on the phone. I am very anxious to meet you in studio. You and I will set that up, but you're doing wonderful work, and I thank you for helping us understand the larger picture. I wish you all the best as we approach the Jewish New Year. I hope I see you often.
Thank you, Saint. My hope is the same, and best to you for the New Year as well.
Thank you very much. There you have it, the thoughts of Dr. Kenneth Levin, author of The Oslo Syndrome, Delusions of a People Under Siege. I want to repeat, J.T. Rogers has written a superb play, directed wonderfully by Tony-winning Bart Scher, and I will be sitting with J.T. Rogers on an upcoming edition of L'Chaim. But if you see the play, just be aware, it's not a historical depiction of the Oslo process. It is a playwright's imagination of what happened in Norway that led to a famous handshake and then broken dreams. My thanks as always to our director Sloan Copeland, production coordinator Serge Goldberg, editor Dennis Golden, JBS's associate director Dara Golub, and to the producer of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.